This afternoon, we're going to talk about the important topic of air power in modern conflict. The United States, more and more, as you are all aware, has relied on air power and including unmanned aerial vehicles. And so we're going to be talking about what the implications of that are, both for warfare as well as for civilians. To do that, we'll have our host today, our National Security Program Senior Fellow, John Nagl, who is also a retired colonel in the U.S. Army and a professor at the U.S. Army War College. He's also the author of Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, Counterinsurgency Lessons from Malaya and Vietnam. One of our guests today, Heather Venable, who's Assistant Professor of Military and Security Studies at the U.S. Air Command and Staff College, is also an employee of the U.S. government. And so we are compelled to say about both John and Heather that their opinions represent their own views and not those of the U.S. government, the U.S. Department of Defense, the U.S. Army, or the U.S. Air Force. I'd also like, before we get started, to say a sincere thank you to our supporters and our members of FPRI. If you're not yet in one of those categories, please consider becoming one of those members or supporters of FPRI, because this content is free to you. It's not free to us. So we are very, very grateful for the support you give us. I'd also like to note that we, as usual, will be taking questions from you. So if you have questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A box at the end. We'll go to questions and answers about halfway through, but Dr. Nagl, I know, likes to sometimes mix in some of those questions a little earlier on in the program. So feel free to put them in the Q&A box as they occur to you. We'll also be showing some maps of Syria and the Middle East, and you can locate links to those maps in the chat box. So without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Nagl.
Thank you, Raleigh, for that kind introduction and for your leadership of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. Very excited to talk about a very important and very much in the news topic today with two terrific guests. As Raleigh said, I've got about a half an hour of questions prepared, but if your questions are better than mine are, I will move yours up in the queue, so please don't hesitate to ask. We've got a terrific panel we've assembled today. First, Dr. Heather Venable is, I believe, recently promoted to Associate Professor of Military and Security Studies in the Department of Air Power at the United States Air Force's Air Command and Staff College. She was previously a visiting professor at the U.S. Naval Academy, where I also spent some very pleasant time. At the Naval Academy, she taught Naval and Marine Corps history. Heather received her doctorate in military history from Duke University, terrific school, and she recently published her first book, How the Few Became the Proud, Crafting the Marine Corps Mystique. So we can get some questions from her about Naval and Marine Corps history as well. And as Raleigh noted, she does not speak for the Air Force nor the Department of Defense, and neither do I. And I am going to note, Heather, and I apologize for this, but we do have an early audience intervention, of which I heartily approve, titled Beat Navy. We also have with us today a representative of a very interesting and important nonprofit organization. Airwars is a collaborative transparency organization aimed at tracking, assessing, and archiving military actions and related civilian harms claims in conflict zones such as Iraq, Syria, and Libya. And they also do important work with militaries to help improve understanding of inadvertent civilian harm allegations with the aim of reducing battlefield casualties. Very important work, as we've seen in the news very recently. Founded in 2014, they've monitored more than 30 belligerents across 6 different conflict countries. And representing Airwars with us today from London is Airwars Deputy Director Dmytro Chupryna, who's responsible for ensuring better protection of civilians in conflicts, working with states and military forces on their transparency and accountability standards, and helping the organization do its very important work. So, Dimitro, delighted to have you with us all the way from London. But we're going to start with Heather, if we can. And Heather, I'd ask you to expound a little bit, as Raleigh said, the United States has increasingly relied upon air power for its wars of the past few decades. Could I get you to talk about how technology has changed the way the United States thinks about war?
Well, first I have to say beat Army. And now that I've gotten the unimportant things, well, maybe it's important, out of the way, I think that the common assumption is often that the American way of war is based on technology. I would say that maybe there's one more assumption upon, that American way of war rests on, which is how to preserve American service members' lives. And that's really what the American way of war is about. And arguably, although not, of course, perfectly, I would say that it's possible that the American way of war also has tried to become, since Vietnam, a way of war that also flips that idea on its head and seeks to preserve civilian lives as much as possible, which of course is never 100% possible in war.
Thank you, Heather. And Dimitro, do you have a reaction to that as you've been tracking the use of air power on sort of the operational end?
Yeah, thanks a lot for a very interesting question. Of course, technology changed over the years, and significantly conflicts move, first of all, into remote warfare, and secondly, of course, to urban environments more recently, which of course caused devastating effects on civilians. And we've seen examples of Raqqa, Hawija, Mosul, and as well recently with Gaza conflicts as well. So it's I would say not only US, but globally, the narrative of the conflicts has changed and technology has changed to more kind of over the horizon principle. And the problem here that in current conflicts, by estimates from another organization tracking casualties, AOAV, it's more than 90% of casualties are civilians. So such campaigns and use of such remote technologies and air-dominated power, of course, causes great civilian loss.
Our last discussion in this series was, I was privileged to have a conversation with Ryan Crocker, who spoke to the recent American withdrawal from Afghanistan. And of course, we are now, the United States is now intending to continue to conduct counterterrorism operations in Afghanistan using over-the-horizon technology of which Dimitro spoke. And as we think about that, we're going to do some thinking about that today. I think that's one of the most important questions we have going forward is how can we do that? What are the challenges with doing that? How can we do that without incurring civilian casualties? Perhaps we start by thinking about the unbelievably unfortunate, harrowing, awful strike the United States conducted as part of its withdrawal from Afghanistan, one for which the Air Force and I believe the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has now apologized. And maybe we'll start with Dimitro thinking about that particular strike and then its broader implications.
Yeah, it's of course very sad, but as well, in our database, there are thousands and thousands of these events, and because of the kind of tragic consequences, and 7 children and up to 10 civilians died in this incident, and effectively the intelligence was wrong here. We've seen thousands similar events in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen, Somalia, and many other countries. And of course, we don't monitor Afghanistan, but of course there are more and more cases which can be found as well and flagged by other organizations as well, where civilians unfortunately died because of it's a whole complex of reasons, and you have to unpack that to understand why and how militaries don't understand civilian harm, don't proper monitor that, and where's the process of lessons learned and how they can change their system, making all these kind of new technologies and new approaches work, where the better protection of civilians would be the first principle, and then that will prevent more and more civilian losses.
Heather, your thoughts?
Lots and lots of thoughts. I think that it's hard to establish what the U.S. military's first principle is, but Mark Clodfelter, in his work on air power in Vietnam, set out the idea of positive objectives and negative objectives, positive objectives being those where you have to use force to achieve them, and negative objectives being those that if you use force, you're actually undermining your own political objectives and your likelihood to achieve them. And so I know that sometimes US military officers in the classroom can get frustrated at the idea of excessive rules of engagement. However, as we saw in Afghanistan, when those rules of engagement were loosened, civilian casualties went up 330%. And when things like that happen, of course, that's not going to help you achieve your strategy because of those negative objectives. You're undermining them so much with the use of force. And so in all of these things, I think that air power is a stand-in and sort of a mental shortcut that we make because it's sort of the visible representation of sort of the idea of a cheap and easy way, this remote warfare. But in many cases, air power is rarely, especially in cases like this, used alone, and there are other things that are going on the ground. And in fact, Airwars' own research has pointed out that a lot of times harm to civilian occurs because air power is being used in support of things on the ground. And so we also have to step back and ask not just about air power, but about military force and its limits in intervening in horribly messy and political and social environments that go back a long time.
And Heather, I note with approval your suggestion that right, this is not air power alone, and in fact it appears that this was as much an intelligence failure as it was a failure of the instrument, that the direction provided by the intelligence resources of the United States were in error. Can you talk to have you done some thinking about that, and can you talk to that at all?
Yeah, it's really frustrating for me as a historian that going back to Operation Iraqi Freedom, trying to conduct my own research on that to understand sort of the transition from the 5 or 6 weeks of the clean cut, I should use that very loosely in this this environment, but the shift from conventional to non-conventional force and wanting to understand what the military was thinking so that it can learn lessons. So much of that is still classified. And so it's in some ways, Vietnam is still the better conflict maybe to learn from. But I think that when we're talking about Afghanistan, we're not going to know exactly necessarily what happened. And we don't know whether it was bad intel necessarily. We don't know whether people loosened the rules of targeting engagement, or maybe emotion kicked in. There's so many different factors. No matter which one, it's a tragic epitaph. But also, as was pointed out, it's not necessarily an outlying event over the last 20 years.
Thanks, Heather. And Dimitro, as you've worked with the military, as you've examined incidents like this in a number of countries, can you talk to the role of intelligence and improving intelligence as a way to reduce civilian casualties and reduce what Heather correctly described, I think, as the negative effects of this tool of war?
Yeah, so there are big differences between the regular intelligence, which supports, for example, like the war against ISIS, and the problem there was over-reliance on aerial observation. So militaries effectively can't see the civilians hiding, for example, in buildings and as well before the strike and after the strike. So most of them were died in the kind of under the rubble of buildings collapsing on top of them. So this probably the majority of those urban campaigns. Sometimes with counter-terror strikes, and as well, it was in the war against ISIS. It's not only US. It's, for example, one of the deadliest strike, Al-Mansoura case, which killed hit IDP camp, which was supposed to be a terrorist base, but it was just a school with IDPs hiding there, killed more than 150 civilians. It was a false intelligence provided by Germany. As well, there are many cases where just the pattern of the target and clothes, some kind of attributions which regularly affiliated to terrorists are just kind of used by regular civilians, and it caused as well some deadly action here. And so these are kind of a different types of how it can be messed up. Sometimes civilians come just in the middle, so when intelligence comes, there are no civilians, but they're coming into the area, and they got into the strike. So there are different reasons for that, but effectively the key thing is just to make new ways of understanding where the harm happened and how we can avoid that. So this is the kind of really big thinking through process which military should come. And again, civil society, monitoring groups, different experts could be an invaluable resource to that, because sometimes we do see more than militaries can see being on.
Because you're on the ground in many cases, in places where perhaps it's unsafe for the military to be?
Not for that reason. We effectively completely remote organization, so our analysis built on open source data, and of course we gather data after the strike, so we don't know what happened before, but we know it only because we gather everything from hyperlocal sources. So effectively what civilians are publishing in Twitter and Facebook, on YouTube, and as well very hyperlocal media sources are telling, and then cross-referencing this information and getting it through very strict methodology, we come out with some kind of a set of credible cases. But effectively pulling this information together, we understand what happened at the scene of the strike, where were civilians, what happened to their families, and again there are some assumptions and can be made why the intelligence can be wrong in this or another particular case. So using this data, we can improve the understanding.
And can you talk then on how you share that data with the militaries involved?
Yeah, effectively, previously it was private engagement, so we just gathered our data set in Google Docs and spreadsheets, and we're kind of sending directly to civilian casualty military cells. But at the moment, they take it directly from our website, so our database is public on our website, and everyone can look at all the cases, and effectively the coalition just take them regularly from our website and provide their own investigation and assessment, and then publish monthly reports, which then classify those cases as credible, non-credible, or open events which are still under investigation.
And Dimitro used the acronym IDP for internally displaced persons. My sense is he may use that again. I think that's going to become, as climate change, political unrest, terrorism continues to be a problem. I think we're going to see more and more internally displaced persons, and their those locations can be sites, because they're in conflict zones, often can be places there that may harbor terrorists, or military forces may think they harbor terrorists. I'd like to stay with this question of lessons learning for a minute and talk to Heather. As a historian of air power, can you talk through how militaries have approached the question of civilian casualties and what they've learned over time?
Well, I think that you can have the most precise weapons in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are going to employ them precisely without the information. I think the US has tried to engage and act on uninterrupted footage, as we saw in the Operation Inherent Resolve, for example. And I don't know what the exact number is, maybe someone can help me out, but Iran's research has shown that the US would try to get a certain number of hours, and if that was interrupted, then the clock would restart and they would need to get that information. And so in many cases, especially with deliberate targets, the targeting process can be up to weeks. And it's kind of ironic in some ways, because the US military are often emphasizing the OODA loop and getting inside the adversary's decision-making cycle. But here, in terms of ISIS, in terms of being able to move their targets, they were able, arguably, to get inside the US targeting process and move around flexibly, because the US was trying in many cases to make sure it had the correct intelligence it gathered to avoid casualties when possible.
And did this process start all the way back in Vietnam?
I'm not sure how far back that process goes. It's probably also dependent on service. You know, even going back to World War II and the Normandy invasion, there are huge concerns about French casualties, you know, bombing our own allies. We also have the irony of South Vietnam, where we're bombing, dropping more bombs on our own ally than other countries in the region. So I think there's always the clash in warfare between sort of the ideal of how we would like it to be, and then the fact that warfare, even with the best technology, still remains ugly and messy and chaotic and horrible.
The most senior officer killed during the Second World War, as I recall, was killed by American air power. At that point, the Army Air Force. And so this problem has existed for as long as air power, I think, has existed. It is unlikely to go away, but there are things we can do. And I think Dimitro's organization is doing some of that work. Can you talk to some of the work you've been doing in some of the countries you're working in right now, Dimitro?
Yeah, effectively, we have a long history of kind of working directly with CENTCOM and civilian US-led coalition and in general, and as well, which then turned out to be a quite big policy development process in cooperation with other organizations, mostly US-based, and we had a whole process of policy development and civilian harm policy mandated by Department of Defense, which is still due to change of presidential administration is a kind of a delayed, but we're still expecting to see it as a good example. And talking about just coming back to that effectively we do a lot of criticism to US and to Pentagon directly on civilian casualties and on those numbers, but effectively US among other allies from US-led coalition among other countries in the world are one of the most transparent and accountable country anyway, because you know, for example, United Kingdom admitted only one civilian casualty from the whole war against ISIS and from 1,000 bombs as well. Belgium and France won't admit anything at all, and Netherlands was just recently opened up this process in the wake of Hawija scandal. Just a reminder, Hawija is the most disastrous event when Dutch F-16 destroyed the whole neighborhood, just dropping a bomb on explosive weapon factory, and the secondary explosion collapsed. And in the wake of this scandal and responsibility, they also promised improvements. So we work now with the Dutch Ministry of Defense, and we had a quite comprehensive, again, partnership with our civil society organizations, comprehensive, which is called roadmap processes as well, also delivering some internal changes, policies and guidelines on civilian harm for their use in future conflicts. So this is something we can work on. It's, of course, it's a lot of information and a lot of components of this process, which we can talk for hours, but usually just a structured way. We go one by one, unpacking kind of the way how these processes work and where we can put some kind of a, better practices in place, or include better understanding and also work with data available by militaries.
Do you have any specifics you'd like to share from perhaps your work in Yemen or Libya?
Yeah, so in Libya is a bit different for us. It's, for example, it's the only country where we monitor all belligerents, so it's all parties of the conflict. And thankfully now with the peace agreement, it's kind of a really calm situations, and we kind of almost see no civilian casualties happening. But we also is probably one of the oldest conflicts in our data set. So we look back for even NATO 2011 campaign in Libya and found out that NATO is also responsible for significant level of civilian harm, which they also never, despite their prominent protection of civilians policy, they never admitted. So again, that's the systemic problem of militaries globally, which we also kind of try to fix, and by establishing those different connections in between militaries, so they also talk together and also learn from each other. So the ones who are more transparent can provide some kind of expertise to other militaries. So that's also the kind of virtuous circle we're trying to create, as they more tend to listen to each other rather than some small NGO from London. And in Yemen, we also kind of have only a fraction of data, because there are a lot of monitoring groups as well working on, for example, covering Saudi campaign. In Yemen, we only looked at the Trump years and airstrikes, and we have the whole report on that with like a lot of data and cases flagged. But as well, it's also, you know, these campaigns in some Yemen, Somalia, sometimes kind of, we call them forgotten wars, because they barely picked up in media, and only due to this kind of a disaster, Afghanistan disaster incident, we got this attention, but other incidents from other countries are barely picked up by journalists, and therefore it's very hard to kind of push government, push relevant militaries to admit those cases. However, we've seen some admittance from AFRICOM, for example, based on our data for Somalia. So this is conversation and engagement still going on.
I found it interesting that President Biden, in his remarks at the UN General Assembly yesterday, no attention to any of these wars, and simply a statement that the United States had ended. For the first time in 20 years, the United States was not speaking as a participant in wars, although we've seen a number of analyses that American involvement continues, whether it's below the level of war or simply a different kind of war, is, I think, very much a topic of conversation. Heather, can I get you to think about that?
I guess that's where my post-colonial viewpoints would come in, and it's convenient when you're a nation and you can just say that, declare the war on your part is over, and kind of leave the mess there. And I think that whatever you think the direction of future conflict, whatever direction it's going, if it's going to be more conventional, if it's going to continue to look more like this, you know, information is a huge part of the campaign that the West needs to be thinking about in those regards. And I think it's difficult because in some ways, you know, the West, the US government, the Airwars all share this emphasis on, to varying extents, stressing the truth with the assumption that the truth matters. But on the other hand, you know, in a sort of a postmodern era, truth is very fungible, and so there's some competing differences there. However, in reading some of the Airwars studies, I did think it was interesting that AFRICOM has started doing quarterly assessments or reports on civilian harm that they've done, which CENTCOM seems to not have embraced that. And if you go back to the proverbial sort of dime, diplomatic, intelligence, information, military, economy, then CENTCOM, you know, may be argued that it's still, the culture is more militarized perhaps than AFRICOM, which is more taking a soft power approach, and that maybe AFRICOM is leading the way and some other commands need to catch up.
And Heather is referring to Africa Command, based in Stuttgart, Germany, and Central Command, based in Florida, Tampa, Florida. And interestingly, the Department of Defense, a good reminder from Heather, the Department of Defense is not just a single entity, but that individual commands and individual commanders may make different decisions on issues as important and as politically volatile as admitting responsibility for civilian casualties based on the determination of individual commanders in the absence of a national policy that, as Dimitro, I think, noted, we're still waiting for from the Biden administration. Can you talk to what you expect to see there, Dimitro, and perhaps when you expect to see it?
We were expected to see it last year, autumn, and it still kind of get a range of postponement, and still we don't know. And with the latest news, it should be signed by the end of the year, but when and what the content, we just don't know. We really hope, because the consortium organization, we submitted 6 comprehensive papers on different aspects, like including even like victim assistance and ex gratia payments, for example, plus through investigations of civilian harm, and kind of it was just a big chunk of recommendations. But what the content will be implemented here, we just don't know. But of course, we hope the best, and we actually wait for it to be at least the most prominent policy across in the world, again, to flag it back to European militaries who are way behind of US one. So that's something we expect, but again, we see that still, as Heather mentioned, there are systemic challenges with CENTCOM coming, like the quality of assessments coming down quite significantly, and as well, maybe you've picked up, there was even a mistake in their annual casualty report to the Congress. They by mistake admitted US, they included European cases as well, which was under responsibility of some EU allies. So that can also flag that there are some systemic challenges kind of with their work with data, and effectively it could be as well with some kind of institutional memory due to changes of a lot of stuff during Trump years, and as well it can be as well the matter of human factor, because we've seen that sometimes it always relies on a particular individual in a command who can kind of draw attention to these issues or not, and therefore the quality depends on that as well.
So we're at more than a half hour. I've got plenty of questions to keep the conversation going, but I'm going to remind our audience that I'd love to see your questions. We put them in the question and answer box. I'm going to start by asking Dmytro what some of those recommendations are that he's been feeding into both the American government and the other European governments that he's worked with, that Airwars has worked with. And I'm going to ask Heather to respond to those ideas and see if they make sense based on her study of and experience with these subjects. So Dimitro, your thoughts on the recommendations you've made to the governments you've worked with on how to be more effective?
Yeah, effectively, they are pretty much straightforward and quite simple. And first of all, it's a matter of capacity, because we've seen that sometimes those civilian casualty units don't appear at all, or appear at the later stages of the conflict. But our key recommendation that civilian casualty monitoring team should be established from the day one. There should be dedicated personnel and at a particular level of command, so it shouldn't be hidden somewhere in the press office, for example, and as well there should be the amount of people with particular skills who can do this work. Again, that's not only own intelligence, but use of external sources. It's not only Airwars, there are plenty of monitoring groups, and including Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, and respectable organizations. So these are all allegations, and reports can be flagged. And as well, if we can do work of gathering this open source data from our tiny office in at Goldsmiths University, we do believe that militaries can also do this on daily basis and proper monitor the situation, but also provide a quality investigation using some kind of a geolocation methods, which we also use in our research. Again, it's the matter of finding where the strikes happen with the most precise location. And we know that these capabilities are available because last year, CENTCOM released the closest location for all credible cases from the war against ISIS, which was I think the biggest transparency move in history. But we don't see it systemically. So That's the question. Again, Trump also in 2018 stopped providing data on strikes, so there was transparency step forward. So the consistency on that, kind of getting these internal structures in place and then publicly reporting on strikes and on civilian casualties with particular standards of reporting would be kind of a minimum package for each military going into the new conflict.
Heather, do those recommendations make sense to you? Do you have any other ideas for either for the military itself or for non-governmental organizations who try to keep the military honest and help us improve?
I really did like the idea of moving the people that would work with Airwars out of PR, which is kind of, in the business of marketing, towards more of an independent location. I think that one of the ironies maybe of the US military is that sometimes the intelligence that it has can be amazing, but it's for example, in OIF, a lot of strikes that it conducted, it did not have the assessment capabilities in place. And so that would seem to be a place where the US military in general needs to improve. And that would be a lockstep in these ways with trying to figure out what happens. And so I too would like the Biden administration to provide these kind of guidelines in a timely manner. On the other hand, if you look at the trajectory of US force employment, even when we've had different presidents, different parties, many things in general, the overall flow and trends are very similar, even though, of course, there are differences at the micro level, but such as with rules of engagement and things like that.
Presidents of both parties, even presidents who have been avowedly anti-war, have found that air power is a very easy tool to use without committing American forces, in many cases without putting any American forces at risk at all, but nonetheless allows them to do something, and in some cases to do life-saving activities. Heather, I'm going to ask you to think a little bit more about the evolution of air power more broadly. It isn't just the United States and Western powers that are using drones. Increasingly, this is technology that's being democratized and being used by adversary countries or possible adversary countries, and even by non-state actors. Can you talk to that evolution and whether you're concerned about it? Over.
I am concerned. However, I think that technology like air power, because it's something visible and that we see, can easily be overemphasized to the extent to which it is changing the battlefield. And I think that war's nature is very constant. War's character is changing, but perhaps less changing than we sometimes act like. And you can see, I think, since air power's establishment, it's gone through transitions of being more offensive, and then defense gaining the ground and offense coming back. And so all of these conflicts need to continually be looked at between sort of here's a development, here's a counter development, here's a development, rather than boom, drones are coming in and everything goes out the window. And so it adds, of course, a huge level of complexity, just like the first airplanes did in making the battlefield more complex. Whether air power revolutionized the battlefield, however, is a debate that, staff college professors like myself like to have, but I don't think that anyone has really convinced me one way or the other.
And Dimitro, are you seeing a democratization of technology, and are you concerned by it?
Our key concern and why we really kind of put a significant focus on that. First of all, these wars are happening. Now it's a bit far away, so it's always an assumption that it's somewhere far away. But again, drones fly over heads, and we are all civilians. So, and our key concern that we are so rapidly moving into new technologies, into use of AI, and to all the package of kind of very exciting things for military to to work on. But our key concern that using classical, remote warfare, we still don't have those systems in place to kind of minimize civilian harm. We understand that it will happen, and even like with the best protocol, sometimes that there'll be events and disaster events. But the problem we encounter now that it's just on systemic level, so it's a systemic level of ignorance and not proper use of those techniques and methods and guidelines to protect civilians. So when we step into AI era, how we can ensure that all of us are protected, and because we don't sure that we are protected now from what we've seen. So that's the kind of a key fundamental questions. And there were several cases flagged of possible cases where AI already killed civilians. So we already entered this era, but what kind of a protection in place do we have at the moment? That's a fundamental question to grapple with.
And Dimitro is talking about artificial intelligence and the idea that there may not be a human in the loop, that decisions have to be made in some cases, or certainly military forces, whether Western or potential adversary, want to make decisions so quickly that with so much data to be processed so rapidly, that the technology certainly exists now to have computers make shoot, no shoot, kill, no kill decisions in the application of artificial intelligence to warfare. Heather, is that something you think about and teach about? And if so, your thoughts?
Yes, I think that historians were really annoying because we always say that there are no easy answers to anything. And so unfortunately, I have no easy answer to AI. On the one hand, it reflects the assumptions of the people that engineer it. And so in that way, reflects possibly our own human failings. On the other hand, we can't really understand or predict, and people aren't sure that we will be to understand how it thinks. And that's what in fact makes it artificial intelligence. The other thing is that, we're already overwhelmed with information, and that amount is just going to increase exponentially. But on the other hand, sort of the calls to outlaw drones and outlaw space warfare and do all of these things, we've seen historically how those efforts may progress before a war, but when a war occurs, then often that just goes right out the window. So, it'd be nice to turn back time, but I don't think that's going to happen.
Although to my knowledge, the United States has not yet deployed artificial intelligence, and there still has to be a human in the loop for offensive weapons. There is, I believe, a feature on air defense missiles that allows them to be automatically targeted and establish a certain computer set of parameters that I think in most cases the military has decided not to use.
Yes, I mean, I know Aegis with the Navy, Iron Dome, some of those issues come into place. It seems like Israel, for example, has gotten criticized for having a strong defensive system, and people argue that that is destabilizing. So it's like offensive weapons are destabilizing, but defensive weapons are too. So no one's going to win with that one.
I'm glad you brought up Iron Dome. In the news just this week with congressional appropriations. Can you talk to that system and what it means for the protection of civilians? Maybe first Heather and then Dimitro.
Well, Israel, it really helps to a certain extent. I'm not sure how many civilians have been killed for what Iron Dome hasn't prevented against, but it's been of Israel's three sort of major defense systems. It provides against the short range weapons, and it has been able to stop a lot. You read in the article, I have a quote, for example, that Iron Dome as a short range missile defense system has proved itself. Well, maybe it has so far, but again, with the continual cycle of action, counter reaction, opponents are going to try to overwhelm it with huge numbers of mass, and it won't be able to stop everything. And at a point, the offense will gain the edge, and then the defense will again gain the edge. And so that goes to the continuing trend of air power, largely being uncontested for the most part for the last couple of decades, but to what extent is that possibly changing in the future, or will drones sort of rule the skies?
Has your organization or you personally, Dimitro, thought at all about technological solutions to some of these air power challenges?
Yeah, it's kind of, we're still quite niche in doing our small job, but as well, our kind of open source approach is already a technology which is not vastly used by military. So we would, of course, recommend as well to kind of, while they gather intelligence as well, look precisely to kind of local communities, and again on some kind of a warning systems which can be found not only by kind of flying a territory and just look from the sky what's happening there, but also kind of listening to local sources as well, which already kind of a source of information, and that's probably the most richest information we found from there. Of course, we capture some kind of international coverage of particular events, but I think the vast amount of events comes from just really hyperlocal sources and people gathering this information. There's a natural question, kind of how to filter fake information, and effectively we had this concern at the very beginning, but over the time we've seen that in the modern world it's very hard to kind of fake anything, because first of all, local communities would again come back and say like this fake, but also it's very easy with using kind of this all this satellite imagery to check the location and the imagery, and as well to match facts together and quite quickly come up with a decision that it's not true. So effectively, in rare cases we can see some kind of a fake events or possibly fake events with one source, and then but they also goes to the kind of the lowest category, and we don't count and don't usually use these events to flag the data. So that will be our kind of a first approach as well, to come to the closer to level of local communities and try to understand what's happening on the ground, and that will provide a lot of insights what can be changed, and again what kind of a tactics work, what kind of tactics were wrong, but effectively dropping 5,000 5-pounders, 1,000 of these bombs on buildings in cities is won't, and then claiming 0 civilian casualties or just 100 civilian casualties won't fix that. So precise weapon can be as well an option, but as well we've seen a lot of events where precise weapons was also done killing civilians. But of course, it's better that, for example, missile won't kind of explode and destroy one level of building, but not collapse the whole building. Effectively, this is the kind of the first way how to kind of make it better. But also there are different and multiple ways of kind of minimize the civilian harm.
So Dimitro has just provided a good reminder that as technology has improved, we have moved from carpet bombing cities to being able to use relatively more precise weapons with smaller warheads, more targeted, that still can do horrific damage, obviously, but fewer civilian casualties than used to be the case generations ago as we apply technology to this enormously difficult question. I'm struck by something you said, Dimitro, about how you gather intelligence and how you use that information to hold militaries to account to help them improve. I think this is also something that the press, the free press, takes as one of its responsibilities. And I wonder to what extent you work with the press, and then I'm going to ask Heather to what extent the free press is helpful in countries like the United States in holding organizations like hers and mine to account.
No, absolutely. When sometimes our information don't get to the senior commanders, but if New York Times publish something, it will get on their table, and of course there'll be a better attention. And effectively on this, we've started with this Kabul strike. It was just consequences that were a lot of foreign journalists in Kabul at that time just covering the disaster, and that's why this case got a lot of attention. But years by years, we've seen cases where there were no media. And again, there's no good channel for us to flag all of them. Again, that can be just ignored by military commands. So the role of media is crucial, and I think the best improvements in civilian casualty tracking in the US happened after those prominent investigations like Unaccounted by Azman Khan, and again, some of them just led to this Obama's executive order, which kind of started this area of civilian casualty tracking in the US military, which was also a big, remarkable step. So it's not only media, it's also the primary legislation, executive orders, and again, congressional decisions that plays a huge role into kind of get the systems in place. And again, only this kind of I've mentioned this annual casualty report from Department of Defense. It's a big, huge step forward. We don't see anything like that in other countries. So on a regular basis, publishing these data. So some kind of these legislation preconditions plus media attention plus public attention can lead to those kind of systemic changes and support them.
Thank you for reminding us of that, the impact of legislation on holding organizations to account, as does the First Amendment. Heather, can I get you to talk to the role of the press in this effort?
Well, on the one hand, of course, the press is hugely important in keeping us accountable. However, I think the press, in some ways, we have to think about, books like Airwars, who have and a lot of the sources that show us how the press is not just always on the side of truth, and how the press ranges from factual to more opinionated. And I think that this flood of information makes this more challenging. And so while the press and the right, and I say right in sort of factually accurate press, has a huge role in keeping the military accountable, I think that it's also more and will be increasingly about shaping narratives. And if we're talking about some of the processes like legislation that can put this in place, I'm also curious maybe about how when the US officers who've spent sort of the last 20 years fighting these wars are being involved in them, and then are born more of the information age than some of the maybe the generals and colonels that we have in place right now. Maybe we'll see more of a shift as the US military embraces looking not only at kinetic operations, but non-kinetic. We'll maybe get a better balance and more sophistication, all within the frame of the West, if we embrace openness, then you can't necessarily just craft the narratives that you want. You have to be open and transparent. And so maybe there's some hope in upcoming generations in shifting those narratives in the future.
Thank you for that hopeful thought. This has been a terrific conversation. I'm going to offer each of you just a couple of minutes to wrap up and tell me in what has been a glass half full conversation, I think, with some organizations working hard, some with more work yet to do. Can I ask you what you see as the future, both of the role of air power in the future of conflict and your organization's work, how you see your organization helping with that? And we're going to let Dimitro begin. I'm going to note, by the way, we had a note from James agreeing with Heather that the press is not, sometimes does have a bias, and that has to be watched, but there are ways, I think, that we can do that while recognizing the big megaphone they have. But Dimitro, your thoughts on the way ahead, both for the department, both for the future of air power and tracking civilian casualties and for Airwars.
Just also a quick reference to the published remark. That's why our kind of assessment is always open. So each assessment of each civilian casualty incident is a kind of a way of describing how we came up with this result, with this assumption, with these numbers. And again, that's the way how we also provided to the media, saying like these are incidents, these are kind of our understanding what happened based on all the sources available and everything we got from the ground. And of course, everyone can compete that, but effectively, I think that's the best way forward. And that's why we have this engagements with militaries, because we don't take position in the conflict. We led by our data, not by our assumptions, and we also completely unbiased and unaffiliated. So, and that's the only way how we can sit with those senior commanders in one room, and because there's just open evidence, and which is on our website. So, and that's the way forward as well. We truly believe that as more attention we have to this, and including this event, and thank you for inviting and for this discussion as well, as more these discussions happen, the less we get away from the military sometimes assumption that they are so perfect and ideal in what they conduct, and they don't need to respond and be accountable. But as well, we're trying to change the narrative, saying like, being transparent, being accountable gives you more credibility with your nation and internationally as well, and provides a lot of opportunities as well. And that's, for us, is the way forward, that as many militaries will open up this territory, and again have these open discussions on these issues of used air power and consequences for local populations, and how we can improve its efficiency, reducing the risk for civilians. And we see ourselves just instrumental part if we're providing some provisional data, some analysis, some expertise, helping those systems to become more consistent across militaries, and of course across different US commands.
Thank you, Dimitro. A set of goals that I certainly applaud. And Heather, as I asked your summation, I am going to push Wayne's question to you. As you sum up, if you see the need for any additional legislation in order to help the military be more efficient, more effective, and safer for civilians on battlefields.
As someone who would love to see less human suffering in war, legislation would be great. However, I think that there are limits to what it can necessarily accomplish. If we look at, especially, I'm just thinking about air power, if we talk about conflicts like Syria, Inherent Resolve, Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, those are not just air power conflicts alone. And so in many ways, it's just the human tendency to use force in general that continues to be a huge problem. I think one of the interesting things about air power in Syria was that the US strategy that caused a lot of consternation in the military was that we had the goal of trying to implement, however, perhaps naively, a lasting peace. And so that led us to use force in opposition to the US's preferred method of sort of overwhelming, throw everything at the problem so we can get in and get out quickly. And however, it is a strategic necessity in many ways to limit human casualties. And I think the question will be, as we approach the future of war, and if we see more conflicts with state actors, non-state actors, rising powers, how all of that will play out, especially with countries that may not have the intelligence capabilities that the US has.
Thank you, Heather, for that terrific summary. Some of the challenges we face I'd like to thank both Heather and Dimitro, while noting that neither of them speak on behalf of the Department of Defense, nor any of its subordinate agencies. I'd like to thank the Foreign Policy Research Institute for hosting this event under the leadership of Raleigh Flynn. And I'd like to thank our audience for their continued interest in these questions of great importance for the future of the United States and the future of all the people who have the privilege of sharing this planet. I wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Thanks so much, Dimitro and Heather.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.